Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to dive right into a seriously fascinating paradox. Think about it. How can an act that involves absolutely zero physical weapons inflict massive, cascading damage on a powerful, heavily armed state?
So, you really have to ask yourself, how does a person simply not eating threaten an entire government? Well, a hunger strike by a prominent citizen or activist is rarely just a physical protest. It rapidly evolves into a highly potent, multi-level political, administrative, and moral crisis. It's essentially the ultimate test of state power versus individual resolve. To really grasp the mechanics here, we first need to contrast traditional protests with the unique nature of a hunger strike. When we think of typical protests, we think of physical weapons, property destruction, and sometimes violence. Now, governments are built to handle that. They have police forces, militaries, and laws designed specifically for physical threats. But a hunger strike? It's a completely different animal. It relies entirely on asymmetric moral leverage and self-inflicted suffering. The sheer physical weakness of a starving individual creates this tremendous, almost unmanageable leverage against the rigid, bureaucratic machinery of the state. To truly unpack this, we are going to break this escalating crisis down into four key areas. First, moral and political damage. Second, administrative and legal dilemmas. Third, financial and security costs. And fourth, the government playbook. And hey, if you stick with me to the very end of this explainer, I'll reveal the secret, calculated strategy that governments actually use to defuse this ticking time bomb.
All right, let's jump into number one, moral and political damage, also known as the shame factor. In this scenario, the state rapidly loses the moral high ground. By willingly taking on immense, literal physical suffering to highlight a perceived injustice, the striker completely shifts the moral burden onto the state. Public sympathy naturally and usually overwhelmingly aligns with the suffering individual rather than the authorities. I mean, ignoring a citizen who is visibly starving themselves to death just looks inherently cruel. And this creates the terrifying threat of martyrdom. If a hunger strike drags on and the striker actually dies in custody, just look at historical examples like the 1981 Irish hunger strikes, it doesn't end the protest at all. Instead, it triggers massive civil unrest and riots. Ultimately, it causes a deep, multi-generational radicalization of the public against the government. It's like lighting a match in a powder keg.
Furthermore, this damage absolutely does not stop at the domestic borders. Prolonged strikes place the host country under an intense global microscope. We're talking intense global media coverage that severely damages a nation's democratic credentials. It hurts foreign relations, and it inevitably draws intense criticism from international human rights bodies. For any government trying to maintain a respectable standing on the world stage, it is a complete diplomatic nightmare.
Moving right along to Section 2, administrative and legal dilemmas, which is essentially the government's bureaucratic trap. That moral failing we just talked about immediately bleeds into severe administrative chaos, and the government gets caught in a brutal double bind. Under constitutional law in many democracies, the state has a fundamental duty of care, meaning they have a legal duty to preserve life. They can't just stand by and let someone die. But directly opposed to that is the principle of individual autonomy. If the state attempts to fulfill its duty by force-feeding a mentally competent individual, they run smack into a wall of international condemnation. In fact, the World Medical Association strictly classifies force-feeding in these cases as cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. They literally cannot win.
To make matters even worse, the government's legal liability goes through the roof. Doing nothing at all invites devastating lawsuits like public interest litigations, or PILs for short. Through these, the public can formally accuse the state of negligence, or, incredibly enough, even abetment of suicide, simply because authorities failed to act while a strike turned critical.
Now, you might be thinking, why doesn't the state just give the striker what they want right away? Well, that brings us to the precedent dilemma. The state cannot simply surrender, because conceding to demands immediately creates a massive, extremely dangerous precedent. It signals to the public that any group, anywhere, can completely bypass standard democratic or legal systems just by refusing to eat. Next up is Section 3, financial and security costs. Let's look at the tangible, logistical drain. As a strike drags on into critical weeks and public anger inevitably rises, we move away from abstract legal problems into incredibly heavy concrete costs. The state has to deploy heavy police or paramilitary forces just to manage the ensuing protests, marches, and potential riots. We are literally talking about millions in daily operational expenses.
And on top of all that security, the state must provide around-the-clock 24/7 medical monitoring, which requires dedicated hospital rooms and specialized resources.
And the medical stakes are profoundly high. Even if the strike ends, the crisis isn't entirely over. The government still has to foot the bill for specialized medical teams to manage terrifying complications like refeeding syndrome. If you aren't familiar with it, refeeding syndrome is a highly dangerous metabolic complication that can actually cause sudden organ failure when a starved person begins eating again. Navigating that requires extreme and very costly medical precision. Finally, let's look at Section 4, the government playbook, and the strategy of calculated delay.
So how do governments handle this without totally surrendering? Instead of using outright force immediately, they typically deploy a fascinating step-by-step strategy. First, they monitor the strikers' health extremely closely. Second, they engage in low-level back-channel talks just to buy some time. Third, they wait for public momentum to peak, hoping the energy eventually fades. And fourth, they offer a face-saving compromise or a minor concession. This clever maneuver lets the striker end the fast with dignity, while the government gets to maintain its core policy stance.
Now, before we wrap up today's explainer, there is a massive takeaway you need to remember. While the mechanics we just explored are completely universal, the ultimate damage to the government relies entirely on two specific things: who is refusing to eat and what cause they represent. A universally beloved figure striking for a widely supported cause? That is going to accelerate this entire timeline and magnify the damage to the state exponentially.
So, I'll leave you with this provocative thought to ponder the next time you look at historical events or the protests shaping our world today. When the most powerful, heavily armed states are completely paralyzed, trapped in administrative dilemmas, and drained financially by a single fasting citizen, who truly holds the power? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating dynamic with me today. Keep asking questions and keep learning.